Sir, I'm not aware how long the box remained in evidence. Cyber crimes, the state attorney's office, they were handling all of that aspect of it. We had CDs of the incident, the shooting, and I don't know how long the box remained in property and evidence.
And those CDs that you had were given to you days after the incident?
A couple days later, that's correct. From
somebody there with Cobb Theater, right?
Detective Smith obtained those.
Okay. Do you know how? Do you know if he got it from a competent source, like a IT person, a computer engineer, a cybercrime expert?
I don't know who he obtained those from.
You don't? Okay. And so then at some point in time, though, that box, were you responsible for also taking that box out and taking it to some gentleman in Orlando?
No, sir.
That wasn't you. That was Detective Smith?
Yes, sir. I went to Alabama to get it, and I brought it back with Detective Smith. We put it into evidence, and that was it. I simply accompanied him there for the long drive.
Detective, you would agree that you were not happy having to go to Alabama to get a vital piece of evidence that should have been preserved right here in Pasco County, right?
Do that again, sir? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'll tell you again. You were not happy over the fact that you had to go to Alabama to pick up a vital piece of evidence in this case when it should have been done right here by your cybercrime unit in Pasco County.
There again, sir, I'm not aware of how cyber crimes, how to obtain that. We were that's the way it occurred. I didn't know that the DVRs were even in Wesley Chapel. There again, cyber crimes is the one that handles that. My happiness, I wanted to obtain the video.
Well, let me ask you this question.
My happiness has no bearing on the trip to Alabama.
Well, let me ask you a question. You certainly interviewed John Sillis, who was the IT person that came in the middle of the night and took the hard drive. You did that, right?
I did not.
Well, did you direct someone to do that? Did you direct some of your detectives, hey, this John Sillis, we need to talk to him? Did you direct anybody to do that?
Sir, as I've testified to earlier, I did not know that the video had been removed, the hard drives.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Redirect?
May I have a moment, please, Judge?
You may. Is that your pen, Mr. Escobar?
Oh, thank you, Your Honor. These are hard to, they don't have much ink in them.
Oh, right. It's a new wave pens.
I know.
Yes, sir.
And you're on my exhibit.
May it please the court, counsel. Mr. Proctor, do you have a copy of Alan Hamilton's statement?
I do not, sir.
Okay.
Counsel does.
I've got it. Sure. Defense exhibit, I think, number 21. It's in the back. Defense exhibit number 21. Excuse me. Yeah, number 21.
For the record, it's defense exhibit number 21. May I approach the witness?
You may.
Detective Proctor, I'm going to ask that you look at that statement, not only look at it, but I'm going to ask you to read it to yourself and see if anywhere in that written statement, Mr. Hamilton stated that it was dark in the theater, and the second thing I'm going to ask you to do is see if he ever uses the word silhouette in his written statement.
If I may.
That's what. I'll just move on.
I'm sorry, but there's no mention of silhouette here?
Is there any mention of dark?
No, sir.
Mr. Garcia, I think I need to clarify for the record, obviously that has not been admitted yet.
Yes, ma'am. Now, Mr. Proctor, let's talk about notes. I think you indicated on cross-examination, based on questions from Mr. Escobar, that you take notes when you interviewed Mr. Hamilton and Mrs. Hamilton. Right.
That's correct, sir.
And once you have memorialized your police report, you destroy those notes.
I'm going to object.
I do.
Sustained. That was.
Right. You took notes, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you write a police report in this case
Yes, sir, I did.
in reference to your interview with Mr. Hamilton and Mrs. Hamilton?
That's correct.
Did you document in that report what they had told you?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did your notes comport with the report?
Yes, sir, they did.
After the report was written, did you then destroy the notes?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. Was there anything different in the notes as compared to the report?
No, sir, there wasn't.
All right. Now, on cross-examination, Mr. Escobar went to great lengths asking you, well, did you ask Mr. Reeves about his disabilities? Did you go into this? Did you go into that? Do you remember that?
Yes, sir, I did.
On the second interview, did you ask Mr. Reeves, is there anything else you want to tell me?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. Now, let's talk about on cross-examination. Mr. Escobar asked you, Mr. Proctor, did you go into the theater and did you ask him to put the manager to put the lights on and the previews on and so on and so forth, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, as you're sitting here today, Mr. Proctor, is there any way that you could have gone back in time and done everything in that theater exactly the way it occurred on January 13, 2014? And by that, I mean, have the defendant sitting in the same seat his wife there, obviously all the other witnesses that were in that theater, right?
Yes, sir.
With the previews playing at the volume with the correct lighting at that time.
I'm going to ask
No.
also speculation as to whether he could have done it or not. I mean, we'd have to bring the witnesses in.
Judge?
Oliver.
Right?
There's no way you can recreate it.
Okay. Mr. Escobar went into great lengths about you going in there and you sitting and seeing this, right?
Yes, sir.
Does it matter what you saw or you heard?
And
If it's you,
yes, sir.
it doesn't matter, right?
No.
Judge, I'm going to object. Move to strike. Leading.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
Rephrase.
Mr. Proctor, what's important is what the defendant saw through his own eyes.
That's correct.
What he saw, what he heard, not you.
That's correct, sir.
May I have a moment, Judge?
You may.
Because I don't have any further questions of
Can we
Mr.
approach
Proctor.
real quickly?
Yes. Released. You're probably going to be on standby. Standby. All right, Mr. Proctor, you're free to go, but if you do get called back, you have to go. Okay? If you do get called back, you have to come back.
Yes, ma'am.
But-
I'm out of this area. Can you give me a day's notice?
We will, Your Honor.
All right,
Thank you.
you'll get a day's notice.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's good seeing you.
You too.
Yes. Been a while. Thank you.
State.
State would call Mark Turner.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give in this call to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Go ahead, Mr. Rosenhausen.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please state your name and spell your first and last name for the court reporter?
Mark Turner, M-A-R-K-T-U-R-N-E-R.
Great. And you don't have to tell us exactly where you live, but what city do you currently live in?
Brandon,
All right. And back January 13th of 2014, what city were you living in?
Wesley Chapel.
All right. Are you currently employed?
I'm retired.
All right. What did you do before you were retired?
26 years in the Air Force and 10 years in the aviation industry.
Okay, and just very, very briefly, we don't need an entire history, but very briefly, what did you do in the Air Force?
I began as an enlisted man and then went to officer training school, aviation school, and spent most of my time in the intelligence arena.
Back on January 13th of 2014, did you go to the Cobb Theater to see the movie Lone Survivor?
I did.
Right. And who'd you go there with?
My wife.
All right. Is there a particular part of the theater that you sit in when you go to the movie theater?
I usually try to find an aisle seat up high.
And were you able to do it on that particular day?
Yes, sir.
When you went into the Cobb Theater, so you walk up a ramp to get in there, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
All right, then you have to turn around to your left or right, depending on what side of the theater you're on.
Yes.
And you look back at the seats, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, when you walked in, do you recall whether or not the previews were playing at that time?
They were.
Do you recall what the lighting conditions were like?
Dimmed, but you could see your way through pretty clearly.
All right, and we're obviously going to be talking about a shooting. The lighting conditions that you're going to describe now, were they the same lighting conditions at the time of the shooting?
Yes.
All right, so let's tell the members of the jury about that. Was it dark like when the actual movie is playing?
No,
All right, so there's lights on at this point.
that's correct.
All right, not the full house lights, but I guess as you indicated, dimmed.
Yes.
All right, so when you're looking at the entire theater, can you see the rows?
Yes.
Can you clearly see them?
Yes.
Can you see people sitting in the rows?
Yes.
How about the aisles? Clear enough to see the aisles?
Yes.
Clear enough to see the steps?
Yes.
Did you have any concern for your safety? And I don't mean like in a super dangerous way, but walking up to go find seats.
No.
All right. Did you need a flashlight from your phone or anything like that?
No, sir.
Could you see 5, 10 seats away from you?
You could.
All right. So you make your way up to where? Is it the back row?
Back row, I sat in the first seat on the aisle. My wife sat inward.
Okay. So if the screen's behind me and you're facing the theater, were you on the left side of the theater or the right side of the theater?
On the right side.
Okay. Well, that'd be facing the screen, you're on the right side.
That's correct.
All right. So if you're sitting, you're all the way to the right of the theater in the back row.
That's correct.
All right. Now, when you sat down, you indicated the lighting conditions were the same as you described it.
Yes.
All right. Do you recall what the volume was like?
It was elevated, but you could still converse.
Okay. And when you say elevated, that's coming from whatever's coming from the movie theater screen.
Right.
All right. And did you have any difficulty hearing your wife, the person you came with?
Not at all.
Did you have any difficulty hearing anyone else around you at that point?
Not so much. No.
All right. Could you hear, the chattering in the movie theater?
Yes.
Right. Could you specifically hear what people were saying, or maybe the better way is, were you listening to other people's conversations?
No.
All right. So you couldn't hear the conversation because you weren't paying attention to it,
Correct.
but you could hear that people were talking.
Yes. I'm going to object. It's like 10
Last-
leading questions.
I understand.
Last two. Sustain.
Based on the level of the volume in the theater, did you have any difficulty hearing anyone else?
No.
All right, we're going to be talking about the shooting incident. First of all, did you know any of the people involved in the shooting?
I did not.
Did you later learn the name of the person that did the shooting?
Yes.
And what was that person's name?
Curtis Reeves.
All right. Did you later learn the name of the person that was shot?
I did.
And what was his name?
Chad Oulson.
All right. And we're just doing that just so it's easier to describe to the members of the jury who everyone is. When you first sat down in the theater, was the defendant Curtis Reeves there?
He was not.
Right. Did you see him at some point in time?
I caught him just as he was approaching my aisle, coming back from wherever he had been.
All right. Did you have an opportunity to watch him come up?
Briefly, yes.
All right. Is there anything about what you saw of him that led you to believe that he had difficulty walking?
Not that I noticed.
Okay. He didn't have a cane or a wheelchair or anything like
No.
that? Did he go by you?
He did.
All right. And did you watch him as he went down the row?
Only in the sense that I turned in that direction to move my knees out of the way so that he could get by. And of course, he was in my field of vision. I saw him go back to his seat.
Okay. Did you see him lean forward or do anything like that when he got to his seat?
Not really. I saw him take his seat. I didn't pay much attention at that time. I was just really kind of scanning the room.
Okay. And based on the lighting conditions, did you have any difficulty seeing him?
No.
All right, at some point in time after he returned to his seat, did you see any contact between him and Chad Oulson?
I did.
Okay. And what did you see at this point?
Just Mr. Reeves leaned forward. There was apparently an exchange.
Okay. And when you say exchange, could you hear exactly what was being said at that point in time during that exchange?
I could not.
Okay. You just know there was an exchange.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
At this point, did you notice whether or not Chad Oulson was standing or sitting?
He was standing.
While Chad Oulson was standing, did you hear him say anything?
I did, yes.
And what did you hear him say?
He said, do you mind? I got a message or a text from my babysitter. I'm checking on my daughter.
Could you hear the defendant say anything in response to that?
I could not.
After that response from Chad Oulson, what was the next thing you saw happen?
Well, something, I guess something was said. I saw a reaction from Chad Oulson where he reached across and grabbed popcorn from Mr. Reeves, from Mr. and flipped it back in his face.
Okay. And when you saw that happening, do you know where? Let me ask you this. Do you know if anyone was with Chad Oulson at the time?
His wife, he was with his wife.
Okay. When Mr. Oulson reached over and grabbed the popcorn,
Yes.
did you see what his wife was doing?
I did not, before the incident, all that I had seen was her hand go up to his chest as if to coax him to sit down.
Okay. And do you recall if she was standing, sitting?
My recollection is that she was sitting.
And do you know how it was that she positioned her hand? Do you recall which way it was facing?
It was her left hand and on his left side of his chest.
Okay. And do you recall, let's say that if she was wearing a wedding ring, was the wedding ring facing Mr. Oulson or facing Mr. Reeves?
It would have been Mr. Reeves.
Okay. So her hand, I'm just using myself as a demonstrative aid, would be just this way facing?
Yes.
Okay. Now prior, well, let me skip ahead just for a moment. After you saw Mr. Oulson, you said, how did he throw the popcorn?
He reached across, grabbed the popcorn, and just kind of brought it back and then flipped it kind of with the flip of the wrist back into the face of Mr. Reeves.
What happened right after that?
Well, I saw Mr. Reeves' arm come up from his side, extend. I saw a muzzle flash and heard the gunshot, and Mr. Oulson was shot.
Was that fairly quickly after the popcorn toss?
It was very, very quickly.
At any point in time, in this entire time that you're watching, do you ever see Mr. Oulson climbing over his row into the defendant's row?
No, sir.
Okay. And are you sitting in the defendant's row?
I'm in the defendant's row, that's correct.
Okay. And where is Mr. Oulson in relation to the defendant?
One row below.
Okay. And at any time did you see Mr. Oulson climbing into the defendant's row?
No, sir.
At any point in time, did you see, other than the popcorn flick, Mr. Oulson throw anything at the defendant?
I did not.
At any time, did you see Mr. Oulson punch the defendant?
No, sir.
At any time, did you see Mr. Oulson in a position where he's leaning over the chair as if to punch the defendant?
No, sir.
At any time, did you hear the defendant exclaiming or yelling anything that would give you the impression he was being attacked?
I did not.
Okay. Did you get the impression from anything that the defendant was doing, physically or saying, that gave you the impression that he was in a life or death struggle?
No, sir.
So you're telling this jury the only thing you saw was Mr. Oulson flick popcorn?
Yes, that's correct.
At any time, did you see the defendant grab his head as if he was injured or hurt in any manner?
No, sir, I didn't.
And that would be before the popcorn?
Correct. No, I didn't see anything.
And at any time, did you see him act as though he had been injured?
No, sir.
Did you ever hear Mr. Oulson threatening the defendant?
I did not.
Did you ever see Mrs. Oulson standing in front of Chad Oulson trying to hold him back as if this raging guy was trying to get into the defendant's row?
No, sir.
After the shot, did you hear the defendant say anything?
Yes.
Okay, and what was it that you heard the defendant say?
Throw popcorn in my face.
You entered my face. And for
After the shooting, did you see what the defendant did
it
with the
took more
firearm?
time than I'm
He brought it back and
comfortable
appeared to lay it in his lap.
let alone
Did someone come up to him at some point in time and take the firearm from him?
Yes.
whatever condition you were in.
After Mr. Oulson was shot, did you see what happened to him?
You were under, you looked at me.
He
and
said,
decided
"I
was
can't
not
believe
worthy
this,"
of the most
and he
basic
turned
human dignity
toward
and respect.
his row
I was
and
not
took a
one of
step
those
or
people
step and a half
who swore
and
to protect
collapsed.
and
Okay.
serve.
At some point in time, did you see Mrs. Oulson?
Yes.
Okay. And what was she doing when you saw her?
Well,
people
she
say
was
they are-
hysterical,
My
of
husband
course,
as well.
and had
You see, he must look at the
began
knowledge
running up
that
and
another
down
man
the
put their
aisle
hands on his
to
wife and
where I
child.
was at. And my wife was behind me. She had been shot in the finger, and
We're both hoping
we tried to help her
that you
with
will
that. We
finally be
had
held
some
accountable
napkins and
made
wrapped
to
her
take
finger up.
responsibility for the
Okay, so when you saw Mrs. Oulson, you saw her
more
finger?
damage.
Yes.
And what did it look like?
It looked like it was hanging on by
I
the skin.
recognize the decision. as to
So
what
you helped her
happens to me now
at that
is out
point?
of my hands.
Tried to, yes.
All right.
Okay, but
Um,
I will pray, though.
At some
I'll
point in
pray for
time,
the
did
next
deputies
person
from the
who
sheriff's
happens
office
cross
come to
paths
the
with
theater?
you
Yes.
When you're in the same.
Did you stay in the
position
theater the
you
entire
were
time,
in,
meaning from the time of the shooting until the time
and
deputies
that
came
you
into the
won't be
theater, or
behind
did you do
the wheel
something
of
else?
you.
Well, I had,
I pray that in uniform.
in an effort to help Mrs.
Someone
Olson,
who
I had
doesn't make you
asked
so
her if there was
angry,
someone that I
you
could
cause
call,
more
and
damage than a
trying to catch up with her, we wound
I
up down
pray
at
the
the
special
exit
woman in your life
by the
is never in
screen
the same
and
situation.
stepped outside, and I asked her if I could call someone to help her, if she wanted to check on her children or
Officer
whatever.
Wilman.
And she
No
said
matter
yes
what
and
your
gave me her cell
punishment-
phone
no
and
matter
told me who
what
to call.
punishment you received
Okay.
today, you're guilty.
Did deputies eventually get to the theater?
Guilty
Yes.
of hurting.
At some point in time, were you given
Whatever
a
excuse you
form
give,
sometimes referred to as a
you
written
and I
statement to
both
fill out?
know what you
Yes, actually, I had to go find it,
And now,
but
Officer Wilman,
there was a
the
gentleman
path
in
we've been
the
on together
in
since
the room that people kind of migrated to to
Your way, and I
get
go
the
mine.
form. It was pretty
I
disorganized at
depart
that
from you
point.
grateful.
Okay, did anyone give you any instructions about how to fill it out, how much, how little, anything like that?
No, sir.
All right, so you just put in there the details you thought would be important.
Yes,
I leave you
Did
knowing
you
that I am
assume at some point you'd be interviewed by someone in law enforcement?
yes,
Were you in fact interviewed by someone in law
I leave
enforcement?
you
I was.
head held high and a smile on my face. This was my victim
At any point in time, did you discuss
victim.
all the details of what you saw with people that were in the theater that you did
I
not know?
hate that you turned me
No.
into a victim. I've never viewed myself as a
Everything
victim.
you're testifying to, is that what you personally heard?
Years,
That's correct.
it's
And
been
personally what you
connected to
observed?
my
Yes, sir.
name More times than I can count. I am no longer your victim, Matthew Wellman. May you always carry a little piece of me forever into your future. Whatever that fixed future may hold, and may it be the future you deserve.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
Judge, it's my understanding Mr. Tabor also wishes to address the court.
Okay. Go ahead, please, sir, and if you could also.
I don't have any further questions.
Thank you. Cross?
My name is Sean Kafer, K-A-F-E-R. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm the project director, or the program director of DocuWM at UW Milwaukee. For 22 years, I documented different events, things that are going on in the community. On July 5th, 2020, I had been following different marches that have been going across the city for over 30 days. I continued filming different marches across the city for over 100 days. I hadn't experienced more violence than I experienced that day on July 5th, watching Matthew Willman leaving that bar, approaching me, breaking my camera lens, or the university's camera lens, knocking it to the ground, throwing punches at me, and then approaching Mrs. Lux, hitting the camera into her head and concussing her. The response was weak from the police that day. We were stuck, waiting for over 6 hours, as they did not want to give any charges to Matthew Willman. Mrs. Lux was told that she can go home. I waited there till almost 10 o'clock at night. Later that night, I was given a disorderly conduct, and Mrs. Lux was given disorderly conduct that night also. The next day, it was dismissed. They did not want us to press any charges against Mr. Willman. That night, I didn't sleep. The anxiety that I have to this day after that incident is great. And the trust in the Milwaukee Police Department that night, and finding out that Mr. Willman was a police officer in the Milwaukee Police Department, made me lose a lot of faith. That's all I have to say.
All right, any other victims that would like to be heard?
No, Judge, thank you for asking.
Okay.
If the court wants to enable the share screen function, I've got about, 3 minutes of video I'd like to share with the court.
All right, I believe it is enabled now, Mr. Heitman.
It is. Thank you, Judge. Can the court see my screen?
It can.
So, Your Honor, I'll start from what my perspective was the initial encounter with Mr. Willman and the protesters, and I'll mute the video so I can talk as it's playing. This is about 19 seconds of footage here, excuse me. The court will see the protesters walking westbound. That's State Street that they're walking on. The court should have just seen it. I'll pause it and I'll bring it back.
We can't actually see any video right now, Mr. Heitman.
Oh, I'm sorry, Judge. One second. I thought you could.
It looks like we can see your screen, but there are just, it looks like some pictures and a couple videos.
Yeah, that's the, let's see here. Here we go. This will do it. Is that better, Your Honor?
Yes.
All right, I'll start over. I apologize. So the court will see, and anyone else who's watching, I suppose, will see protesters here walking westbound on State Street. And I just paused the video, and I'll rewind it. If you can see my cursor right here, I believe the court will see Mr. Willman's wife throw a beverage at the crowd of protesters, and I'll play that 1 second again. And at that point, the beverage has been thrown. She had walked towards the protesters, and then I'll pause this video here again, and I'll rewind it a few seconds. If the court looks over in that exact same area of the video, right about here, the court will notice this is the interaction, the initial interaction, I believe, based on my review of the evidence between Mr. Kafer and Mr. Willman, and I'll play that again. The court will see Mr. Willman, I don't know, almost make a pretty big, a roundhouse type punch. I don't know if that's even a haymaker, I think is the type punch. Doesn't strike Mr. Kafer, in my opinion, there. Mr. Kafer drops the camera. He's photographing at that point. And I believe that's where the lens is damaged, Your Honor. And then at this point, Mr. Willman, can the court see my video again?
Yes.
Okay, and at this point, that's after that, Mr. Willman and his wife are walking back towards where they were seated. So now they would be headed north, walking back north on, that's 3rd Street, Your Honor. And the protesters, the court will notice Mr. Kafer's on the left. That's Mr. Willman on the sidewalk. The court will notice too, that's Miss Lux. She's standing on a table photographing Mr. Willman and his wife as they walk back to the area. Then you'll see that's Miss Lux there. And then at this point, the court can see my screen again. That's the actual striking of the camera back into Miss Lux's face. So after that point, Mr. Willman is pushed back by other members of this group. He ends up falling to the ground and I believe is removed back inside a bar. So that's the instance that brings us here today, or incident, I should say, that brings us here today. It's conduct that shouldn't have happened, and I think the court now knows or has seen the conduct he engaged in. Unlawful conduct. And one of the things I want to echo, and I didn't talk to Ms. Lux or Mr. Kafer today, but I think this is something that is concerning, and if it struck me as well as it struck them without communicating about it, I think it's a legitimate concern, and that's if they're in the city of Milwaukee and they need help, they call 911, right? A city of Milwaukee police officer hopefully responds to them. That's a legitimate concern someone in their position will have, I think. This goes to, I think, the gravity of the offense. I'm Latasha Lux. I'm Sean Kafer. I was victimized by a Milwaukee police officer. What type of response am I going to get if I'm in need of service today in the city of Milwaukee? I hope to God and I trust the city of Milwaukee Police Department will treat them with more dignity and respect than they were treated with on that day. I think is a good way to put it. Mr. Kafer explained the situation in, I think, gentle terms about how they were engaged with by the initial investigating officers, and then through, I think, a very thorough investigation, ultimately, I should say, a very thorough investigation conducted by the Milwaukee police, the truth came to light. The correct parties were held accountable, or party was held accountable, and that's ultimately where we end up here today. And I think, and Mr. Adams will certainly speak more to his client's character, about his otherwise, as far as I'm aware, unvarnished record at the Milwaukee Police Department, which is certainly to his credit in this instance. And that is to his credit. Certainly, the court knows he received the benefit of that acceptance of responsibility by pleading to the amended charge, or I should say the charges in the amended complaint would be a better way to put it. But he still accepted responsibility, and that again is to his credit. I believe Mrs. Lux and Mr. Kafer were ready and willing to testify in this case, but he did not force them to do that, which I think is, again, to his credit. And I know Mr. Adams will speak more to the character of his client, but what obviously isn't to his credit is the conduct engaged in on this day. And I think Ms. Lux put it well, sort of, if you're a police officer, you're never not a police officer. And his actions on this day do not speak well of his character. But again, it's one instance. But certainly, at the moment this was happening, the summer of 2020, very fraught with emotions and the perspectives of different members of this community and all communities really regarding race and law enforcement, and it came to a head here with Mr. Willman engaging in unlawful conduct. The court, I think, has seen the gravity of the offense. I've spoken to the character of Mr. Willman that I know. This is violent conduct, maybe not violent to the extreme, but certainly an act of violence. So I think there is, the court can, fashion a sentence that considers the need to protect the public in the way the court sees fit. And I think with that information from the state and the victims of this offense, the court can fashion an appropriate sentence. Thank you very much, Judge.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heitman. Mr. Adams, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Excuse me. Your Honor, I want to make two overarching points in Mr. Woolman's case in support of our sentencing recommendation, which is for a fine. First, the process of this case has been the punishment. This case is 1.5 years old, and the process that my client has gone through is unlike any other client I've ever had. It is reminiscent of the bad old days before we reformed the criminal justice system in this country, where people were taken to the town square, put in a stock or stocks, their head in with their fists, locked down for some period of time, and where the townspeople would throw rotten fruit and rotten eggs at someone. That's what has happened digitally to Mr. Willman since July 5th of 2020. He's been in a media and social media stockade in the public square. The second point I want to make, the overarching point, is if Matt Willman were a plumber, not a policeman, he would not be here. This would not be a courtroom with any observers. And I think that when we think of the idea of justice being blind and justice being metered out consistently across anyone, regardless of their creed, their religion, their race, their occupation, I think we should remember that if Matt Willman were a plumber, he would not be here. The context of July 5th, I think, has to be noted. Mr. Willman has been City of Milwaukee employee for, at that point, about 14 years, 14 and a half years. In a dangerous job, in a stressful job, in a job where he is not often celebrated, and where every mistake can be blown up into something, but a job that is so important that whenever we think of a crisis, whether it's medical or safety, first responders are always the police. And in the near past, in 2016, he was one of the first responders to the Sherman Park protests, which then became dangerous riots, with a convenience store being put ablaze. That experience, being the first responder, imprinted itself on him. He has, of course, gone to any number of dangerous, scary, traumatic incidents in his time as a city employee. But the context of 2020 is even more telling. 37 days before this incident, 37 days.
Mr. Adams, if you curl the front of the mic, I'm sorry to interrupt. You can just curl it down.
Pretty hot here, and I speak loudly.
Yeah, thank you.
He was responding to the intersection of Locust and MLK in the city of Milwaukee. He had been assigned to, which was his assignment, the motorcycle unit. At that point, at 3:30 in the morning, on May 29, there was fear that the 5th Police District was going to be overrun by a protest that devolved into violence. He, with his squad of motorcycle police officers, were coming down that hill from Locust. I know, anybody coming from the east side knows this hill, near that Burger King, approaching the MLK library, when one of his fellow motorcycle police officers, Patrick Ray, was shot in the leg, right in front of him. Luckily, it was not a debilitating injury, but they didn't know that at the time. There were an angry group of people. He had a fellow officer shot in front of him. They took him to safety. During that unrest, Your Honor will know the Walgreens on that block, someone attempted to firebomb, and the Boost Mobile store and a convenience store on that corner were decimated. The reason I bring this up is because it was just 37 days before this happened. And so in Matt Willman's mind, protests can get out of control. Violence can come after a legitimate protest. And one other thing, he shared that experience of seeing a fellow motorcycle officer shot in his leg with his wife, Maria. And they had talked a lot about policing. They had talked a lot about his job. Maria, who's in the gallery today, obviously married to a police officer, but she's also very supportive of law enforcement. And so much so that in the summer of 2020, she was wearing a Police Lives Matter or a Blue Lives Matter t-shirt around to show her support. I mean, that's how much she subscribed to that belief. So this context is important because on July 5th, having worked nearly daily, responding to different, not only street crime and normal crime, but also making sure that the protests that were all over our city, not only were they on their best behavior, but also that they were protected. And he was working for sometimes 18, 19-hour shifts on his motorcycle, making sure that this city was safe. But he had a rare day off on July 5th. And he and his wife decided to stay in the city. I should note, they live in the city, they're city residents. He's not, since residency has been changed at the state level, many firefighters and police have left. They live in Slinger and Jackson. They come here to work, but they live elsewhere. He made the decision not to do that. He's a city resident. He's from here. He wants to be here. But they came to their downtown to have a beer and to get lunch. Not expecting anything other than that, other than to spend some time with each other. Their 2 children were being taken care of by others. So they're sitting there recreating, and they hear this telltale din of a march, which, again, my client knows very well because he had been responding to these for the last month and a half. And they start to hear some chants. And in particular, Maria hears some chanting over bullhorns of "fuck the police" and "fuck 12" and other things that, given her disposition towards law enforcement, was incredibly offensive. And she decided to give them a piece of their mind. And this is where, if we had one of those, some science fiction reverse the clock, this is where we'd want to go, stop. Let's not do this. This is a very bad decision. She walks to the corner holding her beer in a plastic cup, and she's then engages the marchers with a "All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter" statement, yelling at the protesters. The protesters return in kind, which I think was completely expected, which was "F you," and to call her names and to start walking towards her to respond in kind. Not to engage in any type of civil or productive conversation, but people just yelling at each other in the street. Maria responds to this by flinging her drink. She had a third of a beer in this plastic cup in the general direction of these protesters. And of course, again, the expected outcome happens. Even more umbrage is taken by the protesters, and everybody starts yelling, flicking each other off, using expletives. Somewhere in this time period, Matt Wellman does what any partner would do. Any spouse, seeing their spouse in the middle of something, gets up and walks quickly towards this corner. Sees people taking her picture, getting in her personal space. He responds in kind. It's interesting that the prosecutor used a single vantage point to show, Your Honor, this video. There is a better vantage point of the first part of the interaction on the corner, specifically with Mr. Kafer, from an east to west, looking almost directly at the storefront, where it's very clear, and we noted in our motion to modify bond, early on in this case. It depicts some hand movements by Mr. Willman at Mr. Kafer. Mr. Willman turns back towards the corner. Mr. Kafer then looks down fully after Mr. Willman has turned away from him. It's our belief that Mr. Kafer dropped his lens. It was not struck out of his hands or off of his camera. He dropped his lens. Now, but for Mr. Willman's actions, the lens wouldn't have been dropped at all. And so that's why he's taking responsibility as an act of good faith to pay UWM for that damaged component of the camera. Now, after all this, you can see the Willmans retreat. They are retreating from this commotion. They're backing off. And what's interesting is that the protest coordinators, in every march, there are people who are designated as security or coordinators, and they are telling people to get back. And you can see in that video, they're using hand motions, get back, get back. And everyone but 2 protesters listens to them. Everybody's getting back on the State Street to keep moving west. There's an individual who was shirtless, who does not listen to him. He continues to engage with the Willmans. And then Mrs. Lux, who again has her camera, is first standing on a bench. She did not see that she was in the back of the march. She came kind of diagonal towards those benches, and she climbs over them, is taking pictures. What is very notable, and I think it's mitigating to all parties, frankly, both my client and Mrs. Lux. She had earplugs in, so she couldn't hear the coordinator saying, get back, and she didn't see the hand signals from these coordinators as well, presumably. So she keeps advancing, and she goes over that table. My client, as Your Honor saw in the video, continues to retreat, and at some point he signals that this is done. And goodbye signals with his hands. At some point he does a kind of a prayer, a very pronounced prayer, kind of, okay, we hear you, bye-bye. It was very clear that he was retreating at this point. As Mrs. Lux advanced towards him, it should be noted she had a telephoto lens, very nice lens, and I want to credit Mrs. Lux. She is a very talented artist. Her work that I've seen is exceptional. I mean, it's very nice photographs. Part of that is her skill, part of that is her camera lens and her equipment. But there was no need for her to get right into the faces of the Willmans, given that nice lens that she had. When it was clear and they were just, out loud saying goodbye, 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 advancing, that's when my client slapped her camera. Now, as Your Honor saw, they were very close. If my client wanted to physically harm Mrs. Lux at that point, he was certainly had the ability to push her, to punch her, to kick her, to do any type of physical harm, given their proximity. He didn't do that. He made the bad decision to slap her camera. That was the focus of his action there. Basically, stop taking my picture. I've asked. You're not listening. Slaps the camera. The camera, as you see, is forcefully pushed down into the lip area of Mrs. Lux. Immediately, the individual without the shirt and some other individuals rush in. My client is forcefully pushed into the door of one of the restaurants there. He hurts his bicep. Somebody in the restaurant opens the door and pulls them in, and people basically move on. The march continued on. In fact, Sean Kafer continued on after his initial interaction with the Willmans. In her Facebook Live statements. Mrs. Lugg's prolific user of social media made some very long videos documenting essentially her wait for any type of police action that day. She's sitting at one of these benches outside of one of the restaurants, and she complains of a sore lip. And that complaint is continued in another Facebook Live video that she makes as she's driving home that night. That her lip is starting to hurt. When asked by multiple parties, not just police, but both police and as well as her fellow protesters whether she needs medical treatment, she says no on scene. There is no indication that she is concussed or otherwise in any type of distress other than the sore lip at that point. The process really has been the punishment in this case. We know that the people, you don't march because you're complacent. You don't march because you want the status quo. I am completely sympathetic as a criminal defense lawyer. I am completely sympathetic to why my fellow citizens are marching. We're marching, continue to march. I'm completely sympathetic to the Kafer's Bullhorn Films. Sean Kafer has what looks to be a very dedicated, professional enterprise to document the marches and civil rights aspects going on in this community. And I think that's a good thing. But a couple points. This interaction that happened on July 5th is not, as the prosecutor said, any type of culmination or coming to a head of the race and law enforcement dynamic from 2020. That is not what this is. This is a single incident of a person who was sitting having lunch with his wife. And this event happened. You cannot make this into an event in itself. It should not be. The process of this case, because there was video evidence, not only from the surveillance videos, but the protesters themselves taking video, within the day of this happening, Mr. Willman and Mrs. Willman had their faces strewn across social media, not just in Milwaukee, across Wisconsin, and frankly, across the country. Within a day of this happening, the Willmans' block, their street in front of their house, was spray painted with graffiti. Within the day of this happening, there was a concerted effort to dox, that's D-O-X, the Willmans, to find out who they were and to start taking action, social media action, and more action. Mrs. Willman's place of work, she works for a private employer, was called, was messaged. There was attempts to embarrass them online, to try to hurt their business, a family business. Had nothing to do with any of this. That happened within a day. Trying to not only hurt the business, but to get her fired from her middle-class job. This isn't, these aren't public figures. These are normal middle-class people. But it goes beyond that. We've heard from Mr. Kafer and Mrs. Luggs about the effect of this on themselves and the anxiety of police knowing where they live. Well, nobody protested their houses, but they did protest Matt Willman's house. A one-story, modest family residence in a modest neighborhood in the city of Milwaukee. I included some of those photographs in a pretrial offer of proof to Your Honor. Not only did protesters march on his family home where he lives with 2 small minor children, but they engaged his neighbors. The neighbors who came out thinking, what in the heck is this? They engaged the neighbors. And one thing that they did, the protesters, was have placards. Placards of the prosecutor's boss, John Chisholm, with a derogatory statement about him. Placard of Chief Alfonso Morales saying, fire him. But a placard, and they're public figures, by the way, they can take it. But a placard of my client calling him a crooked cop with his face on it, showing to his neighbors. A nearly professionally produced placard that they marched, and by the way, left in his front yard. Not only did they create placards, but within days of this offense, people started selling merch. T-shirts that said, fire Matt Willman with a fist. T-shirts and stickers. Now, if you're Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or frankly John Chisholm, you can expect that your name may be in a derogatory bumper sticker. But a lying police officer, a middle class, not public person, knowing that that's around, has been extremely hard. After this happened, there was a concerted effort, and the phrase that was used on July 5th by Mrs. Lux when she posted the photograph she took during this instance was, let's make them famous. Let's make them famous. And indeed they have. Your Honor, I have analyzed media on a number of criminal cases. And sometimes it is maddening how little attention is paid to the homicides, the reckless driving, the very serious offenses that occur day in, day out in this community. I analyzed how many media cycles, meaning how many days of coverage this event received. We include today 14 days of media coverage. There are child homicides that do not get anywhere near that type of coverage. And every time that he's in the media, he gets text messages, people see it, people he grew up with, hey, are you okay? Hey, I saw you in the news again. There is a real impact of that on not just Mr. Willman, but Mrs. Willman as well. Let's make him famous. He has received his department punishment. Police and Fire Commission came together. They suspended him for 45 days. That's 45 days unpaid. For a middle-class family, 45 days without a paycheck is a major undertaking. He was also taken off the motorcycle squad. This is something that he had earned, something he really enjoyed, something that he thought he could best serve the city of Milwaukee and keep people safe. He was taken off of motorcycle duty, put at a desk to do paperwork for the last year and a half. Not only is that just professionally debilitating, as Your Honor knows, in public service jobs like this, overtime is kind of where people make their actual living. He's gotten 0 overtime. He works a 9 to 5 doing paperwork. So when we hear about what the punishment should be, all of these aspects, the process has been the punishment to a point that I don't think Your Honor will see another individual with this type of reputational and employment punishment. That's already happened. But the punishment continued through the process. We were going to take responsibility for the disorderly conduct in October when the internal affairs investigation was over. We informed the government, we'll take the disorderly conduct. Let's go to court. Let's wrap that up. Let's let the victims know that they're taken care of. And we were essentially told no. No, no, no. We offered to engage in restorative justice. Restorative justice is a thing that was spearheaded by the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office some 20 years ago by a now past saintly individual named David Lehrman, who was a colleague of the prosecutor, with the idea that when an offense happens in this community, the best way to repair the tear in the social fabric is to have both the offender and the victim get together and look at each other and to discuss it. And that an offender will never be truly held responsible until he looks that person in the eye and they discuss what happened. We offered that to the state. They rejected it. Restorative justice is the peak of criminal justice reform, and that was rejected in this case. There was really no deals offered to Mr. Willman until we were told we were going to have a jury the next day. That is finally when we were offered a deal that met the conduct, which he, of course, quickly took. That was always his intent. As for his character, there's not much more to say. He's a Christian. I'll note, I believe that Mrs. Lux identifies as a Christian as well. And as before court started, I saw them sitting in the gallery by happenstance, right next to each other. Two Christian City of Milwaukee residents. And it saddens me that these people could not engage informally outside of this courtroom and to discuss person to person what this was all about. And frankly, for both of them to understand where the other is coming from, and frankly, so that Mr. Willman could look her in the eye and apologize, person to person. He's a father of 2 children. He's a devoted husband. I've said he's a city resident and homeowner. He has taken responsibility for his act. A churchgoer, and again, this is a first offense. If Mr. Willman were a plumber, again, a first offense, I don't know that this would have been charged criminally. I think this is probably a citation case. If he had been charged as a plumber, he would have certainly been given a deferred prosecution agreement, but he's not. I am heartened that the American system of justice has a judiciary that can weigh all facts in a case and dispense justice in a dispassionate way, that we do not dispense justice by popular vote. That is truly a wonderful thing in our society. It doesn't have any probationary needs. Jail should never be the first item on the table in a first offense misdemeanor case with someone with this stellar type of track record. Jail, of course, is the imposition of state violence on someone, and that just does not meet either Mr. Willman or the facts of this case. The stigma of the conviction and the Googling of Matthew Willman's name long after he dies will include the stigma of this case. He has gone through punishment, Your Honor. No one in our society should be defined by their worst moment. And unfortunately, in the internet age, I think that is what's going to happen for Mr. Willman, both reputationally and professionally. I would ask Your Honor to impose a fine, to know that the scarlet letter of a conviction will follow him the rest of his days. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Adams. Mr. Willman, if there's anything that you would like to say at this point, go ahead, please.
Yes, Your Honor. Just briefly, I would like to take this moment and apologize for my actions on July 5th, 2020. My wife became involved in an incident while we were out to lunch. Fearing for her safety, I intervened. Looking back on this day, I believe I could have used better judgment and restraint. I have dedicated 16 years of my life serving the city of Milwaukee and its citizens, and have never failed in doing so. Many times, I have placed my safety secondary to others while performing my duties. I apologize that my actions that day have brought discredit to not only my family, but my department. I regret my actions on that day. Moving forward, I will use this incident to remind me of how my actions need to be held to the highest standard. I do want to sincerely apologize to all parties that have been involved in this incident. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Willman. The law says that when I sentence someone, I have to take into account or set certain sentencing goals. Okay. Now, those goals are potentially punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. The way I set those goals is I look at 3 different sentencing factors. I consider the gravity of the offense, I consider the need to protect the public, and I also consider the defendant's character and any rehabilitative needs. Okay. I'm going to start by saying that I don't think that you have any rehabilitative needs per se. Okay. So the sentencing goals are going to be punishment and deterrence. All right. Prior to this case was set for trial, and prior to that, I told the parties that on the record that I wanted this case. This was during pretrial motions, and I told the parties that I want this case to be tried as, to stay as closely to the issues at hand as they occurred on that day as possible. And so when I sit here today and I look at the record and I consider the sentencing remarks of the state and the defense, I still want to impose a sentence that, while taking into account what occurred on that day and the different things that were involved, that still, hews as closely to the actual charge in this case, okay, which is disorderly conduct and a citation for disorderly conduct, okay? There is no question that what occurred was serious. Okay, not only in the sense that there was harm to the victims. Okay, there was a damaged camera. There were some injuries. Okay, the amended complaint just alleges that there was otherwise disorderly conduct. Okay, when you watch the video, the first video that the state showed is a little bit harder to see, okay, because Mr. Willman, you were stationed further away in that shot. The second one, when Mrs. Lux was approaching you and taking taking your photo, was much closer, much easier to see, okay? And when you turned around and you struck the camera, that to me seemed like a violent act. It was a violent act, okay? And, you could say it was a slap. It's hard to tell from the video whether it was open-handed or closed-handed, but, it was a roundhouse. And you made contact with the camera, which is close enough to her face that, you should have recognized that punching at her camera at that point was like punching her, okay? Because if you hit that camera, where is it likely to go? Which is what happened, okay? So when I talk about the gravity of the offense, Mr. Adams stated that, made a reference to justice being blind, okay? And that is true. In the same regard, when I look at the gravity of the offense, I can't ignore the fact that you are a sworn law enforcement officer, okay? And that doesn't mean that justice treats you any differently, but it does mean that you're held to a higher standard, okay? And I think you realize that. And you've already suffered many of those consequences of being held to that higher standard, okay? On the one hand, you are held to a higher standard. On the other hand, as your attorney mentioned, you likely also took a lot more heat for this than you would have otherwise if you had not been a law enforcement officer, okay? And, that is, in some respects, and I'm not, passing judgment on what happened or didn't happen after this necessarily. But what I'm saying is that, you know, in some regards, because you are held to a higher standard, it's to be expected that you would take more heat. But the flip side is that you've taken that heat, okay? You've taken those consequences at this point already. The case has been going on for a year and a half, a little more. Okay, you've already, your attorney referenced the suspension without pay, okay? That's a consequence that someone in a different profession would likely not have undergone, right? Had to suffer those consequences, and you did, okay? Two other things come to mind here when I'm considering what occurred that day. I understand that you were, you know, your wife left the establishment first to, you know, approach the protesters. It's understandable that you would want to go out and, you know, protect your wife or try to bring her back in, whatever the case may be, but at some point you also engaged with the protesters. So I can't ignore the fact that, you know, this was really instigated by you, okay? As a police officer who, you know, you were eating downtown, you just wanted to enjoy a meal, okay? You could have very easily made the decision to stay inside the restaurant and not engage. You know, you said you had seen plenty of protests that summer, right? So you would think maybe you just want to avoid it, enjoy the time, right? The other thing is, again, on the video that was played here today when you're walking back to the bar, at the point where Miss Lux is following you and taking your picture, it doesn't appear that she's that close to you, right? Where you had to turn around and, you know, push the camera out of the way or whatever. You could have gone back into the bar, but you didn't. Okay, you turned around and you swatted at her camera. And so, you know, to me, that is an aggravating factor. The fact that you chose to go outside and engage. And I understand, again, it was, you know, your wife had gone out first, and but you could have, you know, done more to get back inside. And then, you know, once it was just a couple protesters following you, you still decided to turn back around when you could have gone inside the restaurant and, you know, maybe avoided, you know, the worst part of this from happening, okay? In general, there is a need to protect the public from these type of altercations, okay? I'm not saying that there's a need right now to protect the public from you, Mr. Woolman. I don't think that you're a danger to the public right now, okay? But in general, there's a need to deter these types of things from occurring, all right? When I look at your character, it appears overall you have good character, okay? You have a good record other than this offense. You don't have any prior convictions. And to get to the point where you are in life, you know, I think that would speak overall well to your character, that you're in general a law-abiding person, right? And that is it's a very mitigating factor here. You have a good work history. You have a family that you support, which would also speak well overall to your character, okay? As I said, I'm looking at the facts of this case and adhering as closely to the facts as they occurred here that I can when I'm determining what type of sentence to impose, okay? Aggravating is that, again, this could have been avoided. And the main responsibility for that, I think, lied with you. When you chose to go out and engage with the protesters, and then when you chose to turn around, not return to the bar, and swat at Mrs. Luke's camera, or again, it was a pretty violent swing from what I saw in the video. Okay, mitigating is the fact that this is your first criminal conviction. You have no prior record. Okay? And again, that would tell me that overall you have good character. And I want to reiterate, you are held to a higher standard as a law enforcement officer. But I believe that because of that, you've also suffered consequences that other individuals would not have suffered as a result of what you did. Okay? It's not to impose jail time on anybody is not a thing that this court takes lightly, or that any court should take lightly, to deprive someone of their liberty, okay? Especially in this particular case, when this is your first offense, okay? So when I consider, and I want to state for the record, I've had an opportunity to review the victim impact statements and the victim request for restitution, okay? So when I consider all of these things, I consider the sentencing goals of punishment and deterrence. I consider the seriousness of what occurred, the need to protect the public, and I also consider your character. I think a fair sentence in this case is as follows. As to count 1, the misdemeanor disorderly conduct, I'm going to impose the maximum fine of $1,000, okay? I am going to order that you pay restitution to UW Milwaukee in the amount of $1,099. You'll have to submit a DNA sample and pay the related DNA surcharge. Okay. As to count 2, the citation for disorderly conduct, I will also impose the maximum fine of $250. Mr. Willman, I've tried to be fair with you here, considering everything that's been stated on the record, everything that's been filed before this hearing. Okay, if you disagree with my sentence, you do have the right to appeal. Your attorney can help you out with that. Basically, you have 20 days to decide if you want to appeal and to notify the court. Mr. Adams, is there any sentence credit?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. I'll also have you pay all court costs and applicable surcharges and assessments, okay? As far as a deadline to pay that, Mr. Adams?
We would ask for 6 months.
Right, 6 months to pay. Failure to pay would result in a potential civil judgment and tax intercept.
That's August 17th.
And as far as a deadline to submit the DNA, Mr. Adams, you think you can get that done today?
Yes.
All right, I'll have you submit that by the end of today. Anything further?
You make it tomorrow, just in case there's a hiccup down there.
Okay.
Sometimes they're closed.
Sure. Tomorrow then, by the end of the day.
Thank you.
All right, anything further from the parties?
Thank you, Jeff.
Not from the state, Judge. Thank you for letting me appear via Zoom.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you. We're off the record.